The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Major William Hayes adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. 23 years of service in the British Army had taught him that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death, and old habits died hard even in ceremonial duties. The crisp autumn air carried the distant sounds of London traffic. But within the palace grounds, an almost sacred silence prevailed. Hayes had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq before. Being selected for the prestigious Queen's Guard, his chest bore the ribbons of valor, the Military Cross for Gallantry, the Operational Service Medal, and the Afghanistan Campaign Medal. Each ribbon told a story of sacrifice, of brothers lost, of moments when courage was the only thing standing between chaos and order. The transition from active combat to ceremonial duties had been jarring at first, but Hayes had come to understand the profound importance of his role as a guardian of British tradition and values. The day's schedule included a high-profile diplomatic visit from American officials, including Vice President J.D. Vance. Hayes had been briefed about the visit during the morning assembly, where his commanding officer had emphasized the importance of maintaining the highest standards of military bearing. The Royal Guard's reputation was built on centuries of unwavering discipline, and every interaction with foreign dignitaries was a reflection of British military excellence. As Hayes took his position at the palace entrance, he reflected on recent news reports that had been circulating among the troops. Social media and news outlets had been buzzing with controversial statements made by Vice President Vance regarding British military involvement in international conflicts. The comments, made during a political rally in Ohio, had suggested that British soldiers were following America's lead rather than showing real initiative in joint operations. The remarks had sparked outrage among military communities on both sides of the Atlantic. Hayes remembered the faces of his fallen comrades. Thompson, who had saved 6 civilians in Helmand Province before an IED took his life. Rodriguez, an American soldier who had fought alongside Hayes in a brutal firefight near Kandahar, and countless others who had paid the ultimate price for their service. The idea that their sacrifice could be minimized or their courage questioned by someone who had never worn a uniform in combat struck deep into his core. The palace courtyard began to fill with officials, security personnel, and diplomatic staff as the arrival time approached. Hayes maintained his stoic expression, but his mind wandered to the young recruits he had trained over the years. Many of them had gone on to serve with distinction in some of the world's most dangerous places. The British military's traditions of honor, courage, and commitment were not mere words on a regimental motto. They were principles carved into the soul of every true soldier through fire, loss, and brotherhood forged in the crucible of battle. The black motorcade rolled through the palace gates with practiced precision, its occupants visible through the bulletproof windows. Hayes watched as security teams swept the area one final time, their earpieces crackling with constant communication updates. The diplomatic protocol machine was in full motion, with every detail choreographed to ensure both security and proper ceremonial respect for the visiting American delegation. Vice President J.D. Vance emerged from the lead vehicle, his navy suit impeccable and his demeanor confident as he surveyed the historic surroundings. Behind him, a small entourage of advisors, security personnel, and diplomatic staff arranged themselves according to predetermined positions. The American flag pin on Vance's lapel caught the morning light as he straightened his tie and prepared. For the formal reception, Hayes observed the vice president's movements with the trained eye of a professional soldier. There was something in Vance's bearing that reminded Hayes of politicians he had encountered during military briefings, confident in their authority but lacking the weight that came from personal experience in the field. The contrast was stark when Hayes compared it to the bearing of combat veterans, who carried themselves with a different kind of quiet strength born from facing real danger. Alongside their brothers in arms, the palace staff moved with British efficiency, ensuring that every aspect of the welcome ceremony proceeded according to ancient protocols. Representatives from the Foreign Office exchanged quiet words with their American counterparts, smoothing any potential diplomatic rough edges before the formal proceedings began. The Union Jack and Stars and Stripes flew side by side above the palace, symbols of the enduring alliance between the two nations. Despite occasional political tensions, as Vance approached the palace entrance where Hayes stood guard, the vice president's communications director whispered something in his ear. Hayes caught fragments of their conversation, something about photo opportunities and messaging for the American media back home. The political calculation behind every gesture was evident, and Hayes found himself thinking about the stark difference between serving one's country and serving one's career ambitions. The morning breeze carried the scent of autumn, leaves from Hyde Park, mixing with the diesel fumes from the idling security vehicles. Hayes maintained his rigid posture, but his peripheral vision tracked every movement of the approaching delegation. Years of combat experience had honed his awareness to razor sharpness, and even in this ceremonial setting, his mind automatically assessed potential threats and escape routes. The habits of a warrior never truly disappeared. They simply adapted to new environments while remaining eternally vigilant. The formal reception line had been carefully arranged according to diplomatic precedents, with each participant knowing exactly where to stand and when to move. Hayes watched as Vice President Vance worked his way through the initial greetings with British officials, his practiced political smile never wavering. The handshakes were firm, the eye contact deliberate, and the conversation filled with the kind of diplomatic pleasantries that had been refined over centuries of international relations. Palace. Photographers captured each moment with professional precision, their cameras clicking in rhythm with the carefully choreographed proceedings. Hayes noted how Vance seemed particularly aware of the camera angles, adjusting his position slightly to ensure the most favorable shots for the American press pool. The vice president's media team watched from the sidelines, no doubt already crafting the narrative that would accompany these images when they appeared in newspapers and on television screens across America. As the reception line progressed, Hayes found himself remembering a conversation he had shared with an American Marine in a forward operating base outside Kabul. The Marine, a sergeant from Texas named Miller, had spoken with genuine respect about the British soldiers he had served alongside. Miller had described the quiet professionalism of the British forces, their ability to build relationships with local communities, and their unwavering courage under fire. The conversation had taken place during a brief lull between patrols, over cups of bitter coffee and MREs, but the sincerity of Miller's words had stayed with Hayes long after they had both rotated back to their home countries. The contrast between that authentic respect between warriors and the political theater now unfolding before him was stark. Hayes had read the transcript of Vance's rally speech online, where the vice president had suggested that British forces were merely following American leadership rather than showing real backbone in international operations. The words had stung not just because they were inaccurate, but because they dismissed the blood and sacrifice that Hayes and his comrades had willingly given in service of the alliance between their nations. A slight commotion near the media area drew Hayes' attention for a moment. One of the American journalists was having technical difficulties with her recording equipment, and palace staff were quietly assisting her while trying to maintain the dignity of the proceedings. The incident served as a reminder that beneath the polished surface of diplomatic events, real people were working to document and communicate these moments to the wider world. The autumn sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard and warming the air slightly. Hayes could feel a bead of perspiration forming beneath his ceremonial bearskin cap, but his training kept his expression neutral and his posture perfect. The weight of tradition, represented by his uniform and his position, was both a source of pride and a tremendous responsibility that he had never taken lightly throughout his years of service. The moment arrived with the inevitability of a military operation reaching its crucial phase. Vice President Vance, having completed his greetings with the senior diplomatic staff, approached the section of the palace entrance where Hayes stood guard. The vice president's advance team had clearly briefed him about the photo opportunity this presented. A handshake with a member of the famous Queen's Guard would provide excellent imagery for American media consumption and demonstrate the strength of the transatlantic partnership. Hayes watched as Vance's confident stride brought him directly into range. The vice president's hand was already extending in preparation for what he obviously expected to be a routine ceremonial handshake. Behind him, photographers adjusted their positions to capture the moment from multiple angles. Their lenses focused on what would surely become one of the defining images from the diplomatic visit. In that split second before contact, Hayes' mind flashed through a kaleidoscope of memories. He saw the faces of British soldiers who had died fighting alongside Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. He remembered the joint operations where British and American forces had bled together, fought together, and protected each other with the fierce loyalty that only combat could forge. He thought of young British recruits who looked up to him as an example of what military service should represent: honor, dignity, an unwavering commitment to principle. The weight of Vance's words from that Ohio rally pressed against Hayes' consciousness like a physical force. The suggestion that British soldiers lacked initiative, that they were merely followers rather than leaders, that their contributions to international security were somehow secondary or subordinate to American efforts. These words had spread through military communities like wildfire, causing genuine hurt and anger among soldiers who had risked everything in service of the alliance. Hayes' hand remained firmly at his side as Vance's extended hand hung in the air between them. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. The vice president's confident expression began to shift as he realized that the expected handshake was not forthcoming. The photographers continued clicking their shutters, but now they were capturing something entirely different from what had been planned. The tension in the courtyard became palpable as onlookers began to understand what was happening. Diplomatic staff exchanged worried glances, security personnel shifted slightly in their positions, and the American delegation stood frozen in a moment that threatened to spiral beyond anyone's control. Hayes maintained his military bearing, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his posture perfect despite the emotional storm raging within his chest. This was his moment to make a statement that words alone could never convey. The aftermath of the refused handshake rippled through the palace courtyard like shockwaves from an explosion. Vice President Vance's hand slowly lowered to his side, his political composure wavering for just a moment before reasserting itself. The cameras had captured everything, and everyone present understood that they had just witnessed a moment that would define this diplomatic visit far more than any prepared speeches or formal ceremonies. Hayes remained motionless, his discipline absolute even as he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. His commanding officer, standing at a discreet distance, maintained his own professional bearing while no doubt calculating the potential ramifications of his sergeant major's actions. The British diplomatic staff looked stricken, understanding immediately that this incident would require extensive damage control and careful explanation to prevent it from escalating into a larger international incident. Vance recovered quickly, his political training kicking in as he continued past Hayes without acknowledging the snub directly. His security detail and staff followed, their faces masks of professional neutrality that barely concealed their shock at what had transpired. The vice president's communications director was already reaching for her phone, no doubt preparing to manage the narrative that would inevitably emerge from the photos and video footage now racing toward news desks around the world. Behind the scenes, rapid consultations began among both British and American officials. The British Foreign Office representatives huddled with their counterparts from the American embassy, speaking in urgent whispers about how to prevent this incident from damaging the broader relationship between the two nations. Protocol officers scrambled to adjust the remaining schedule, looking for opportunities to create positive imagery that might overshadow the dramatic moment that had just occurred. Hayes continued his duty, standing guard as the diplomatic procession moved into the palace for their scheduled meetings. His action had been personal, driven by his deep sense of honor and his commitment to defending the reputation of the soldiers he had served alongside. But he understood that the consequences would extend far beyond his individual statement of principle. The uniform he wore represented not just himself, but centuries of British military tradition and the current relationship between two allied nations. As the immediate crowd dispersed, and the courtyard returned to its normal quiet dignity, Hayes allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had made his choice based on conscience and conviction, knowing full well that it would likely end his career in the Queen's Guard and possibly in the military altogether. But some things were more important than career advancement or diplomatic convenience. The memory of fallen comrades and the honor of British military service were among those things that could never be compromised for political expedience. Within hours, the incident had exploded across global media networks with the velocity that only truly significant news could achieve. The photographs and video footage captured by the Palace press pool showed the moment with crystal clarity. Vice President Vance's extended hand, Hayes' resolute refusal, and the shock on the faces of everyone present. Social media platforms erupted with commentary, debate, and analysis from every conceivable angle, turning what had been a single moment of personal conviction into a worldwide phenomenon. British military veterans rallied to Hayes' defense with overwhelming support. Former soldiers who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan flooded social media with their own stories of valor and sacrifice, using hashtags that celebrated British military courage and condemned Vance's earlier remarks. Military charities and veteran organizations issued statements backing Hayes' action, describing it as a principled stand for military honor in the face of political disrespect. The political ramifications proved swift and severe. The British government found itself in the delicate position of needing to maintain diplomatic relations with America while addressing the genuine outrage Hayes' action had sparked among military communities and the general public. Parliamentary debates erupted over military funding, veteran support, and the proper respect owed to those who serve in uniform. Opposition politicians seized on the incident to criticize the government's handling of military affairs and its relationship with American political figures. Hayes was immediately relieved of his ceremonial duties and called before a military tribunal to explain his actions. The hearing, conducted behind closed doors, became the subject of intense media speculation and public interest. Military law experts debated whether Hayes had violated regulations or had acted within his rights as a soldier bound by conscience. Petitions supporting him gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures, while legal defense funds, established by veteran groups, raised substantial amounts for his potential court costs. The international diplomatic community watched with fascination and concern as the incident continued to generate headlines weeks after the initial event. American political commentators found themselves divided, with some defending Vance's original remarks while others criticized them as unnecessarily inflammatory. The episode became a case study in how individual actions could cascade into major international incidents in the age of instant global communication. For Hayes, the personal cost was significant but bearable. Though he faced potential discharge from the military and the end of his ceremonial career, he found peace in his decision. Letters of support poured in from around the world, many from American veterans who understood the brotherhood that transcended national boundaries. His action had sparked a global conversation about respect, honor, and the proper recognition owed to those who risked their lives in military service. In the quiet moments after the storm, Hayes reflected that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with the simple act of standing firm in one's principles when everything else demanded compromise.